Howdy, this is the Mad Philosopher podcast. This is a little out of the ordinary for what I usually do, but this is a good example of kind of an audio vignette that you'll get as a Patreon subscriber. It's Patreon exclusive content, so, if you want more of these sorts of things, you're going to have to pay me at least $1 an episode, which lately has come out to about $2 a month, but it's supposed to be somewhere in the ballpark of $4 to $6 a month. I just need to be more proactive in my product, or my content creation. So, what is this? This is an audio vignette where I kind of just monologue about a particular subject that happens to be on my mind at a given point in time, just so that I can get it out into the world, because it's a lot easier to talk for 10 to 15 minutes as opposed to going on and typing and writing and doing all the blog post type stuff, because I'm not at my keyboard as often as I would like to be these days. So, what am I talking about today? Well, there's a blog post I made several years back at this point called Paradigmatic Awareness, and I kind of wanted to dive into that a little bit more because it's an issue that's been on my mind a lot as I've been doing my anarchist consulting gig, as I've been going back and starting to argue with communists on the internet again, and as I've encountered a bunch of epistemic issues at work. So, there's a lot of reasons why this is on my mind these days. So, what is paradigmatic awareness? Well, paradigmatic comes from the word paradigm, which basically just means the framework in which everything else is operating. And then awareness, of course, is, being aware of things. So being aware of the frameworks that people are using when they're discussing is kind of important, because a lot of times you can end up talking past each other, right? One person will make one political statement and another person will make another political statement, and then they'll both accuse each other of the same thing, when in reality all of the words that they're using are either synonymous or so radically divergent from each other that they're either agreeing with each other and not knowing it, or they're accusing each other of the thing that they themselves are guilty of, and vice versa, and it gets very hairy very fast. So, the reason this is on my mind these days as well is I'm going back and rereading a lot of the philosophical texts that I read back when I was operating within the paradigm of Marxism, right? I used to be a Marxist. I didn't used to talk about it very much, and now it seems to be the only thing I talk about, courtesy of, doing guest spots on podcasts and things like that. So, operating within a certain paradigm, people tend to get kind of boxed into their vocabulary, into their worldview, into their ontology, their understanding of what exists and the way that it exists, the kind of hierarchy of the things that exist. If I say, everything consists of monads, that sets up a certain paradigm, and the monads behave in these ways, and then they build everything else up to something different. Or I could say, string theory is the basis of everything. Or I can say all that stuff is garbage. The things that I can see and touch and taste right now is what's real, and then everything else are abstractions from those things. Those are all different ways of looking at the same phenomena that we all experience. Leibniz would blame his traffic ticket on monads and the preordained harmony of God. A particle physicist will blame different energy states and the boundary conditions of the universe for his traffic ticket. And then the pragmatist will blame the police officer and the fact that he was speeding for his speeding ticket, right? So it's all a bunch of different levels of ontology that people use different ways of looking at the world. It's a different paradigm in which they reside. So I'm going back and rereading a little bit of Karl Marx, some Max Stirner. I'm rereading Ayn Rand. I'm rereading the greats of the Austrian school. I'm rereading Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, and Hans Hermann Hoppe. All these thinkers have been very influential in my creation of my paradigm. But like yesterday, I was arguing with somebody on Facebook. I wasn't really arguing because we never elevated to that level of conversation. It was more like a meet and greet between an anarcho-capitalist, myself, and somebody who, as best I could peg it, was just a democratic socialist, but they claimed that they were a libertarian for reasons, and then they're a big fan of Noam Chomsky, and that was a big part of the conversation as well. So it's kind of difficult to place this guy in any sort of framework, and so I just kept asking questions to try to understand his paradigm, and it looks like he lacked awareness of the paradigm in which he was operating, which makes it very difficult to have a conversation, what people would call across party lines, right? I'm operating in one paradigm, you're operating in the other, we have to find a common vocabulary, or we're never going to be able to talk. As you can tell, these audio vignettes are kind of all over the place as I think of things, as opposed to some sort of outlined thing that are my usual posts that I charge money for. So the ideas in philosophy are the same way. I used to read philosophical texts in a historical vacuum, and that was because I was reading historical texts as an 8-year-old, which, you don't have a categorical knowledge of the human history. Your concept of human history consists of what I did last week and what I'm going to do next week, and that's about it when you're an 8-year-old, right? Maybe in the future, we're going to go to Disneyland in the summer, but right now it's October, so, that's a fairy tale just like any other. So, reading Aristotle, I had no concept of the fact that this was a guy that lived 2,000 years ago, 2,200 years ago, whatever, and he was talking about what it's like to live in Greece as an aristocrat who has a bunch of slaves working for him and all that kind of thing. I just knew this guy was writing about virtue. I knew this guy was writing about physics and science, and so I had no way of knowing that his scientific paradigm was different than the normal operations of science in the modern era, or in our contemporary age, things like that. And as I learned that there's a historical context for these documents that people wrote, there's a lot more understanding that comes into it. And I'm not saying we have to do some sort of postmodernist psychological analysis of authors and figure out he wrote this because he had issues with his father, and then he wrote that because of this childhood trauma, and then he wrote that because he was racist, right? We don't have to do that, but we got to at least know where the ideas came from, right? I don't really believe in any sort of creatio ex nihilo, right? Nothing comes out of nothing, so something has to come from somewhere, right? And I guess something has to come from something that's prior to it. And the reason why this is important is because, for instance, I'm reading Max Stirner right now. And Max Stirner, he goes on about the ego and about how egoism operates and these sorts of things. And if you pay attention and you know the history around it, you can start to see a lot of kind of early anarchist thought like Proudhon emerging. You can see a lot of things from Marx himself emerging. You can see some of the earlier socialists than Marx start to emerge. And I'm not saying that automatically discredits Max Stirner as some sort of communist or something like that, even though I am in the camp of throw communists from helicopters. But ultimately, right, that gives me a paradigm by which to understand his vocabulary, because he'll start to use certain economic terms in a way that don't make sense to an Austrian economist. And it's like, well, why is he using that word that way? I'm confused. But then if you understand he's using a Marxist version of that word, then you can fit it right into its context, and it just slots right in, and everything's fine. So rather than arguing about vocabulary with an egoist, which I kind of used to be an egoist, I never quite really adopted the title, but whatever. When you're discussing with an egoist, then rather than arguing about the finer points of vocabulary, you can just clarify, by this word you mean this. Okay, then what about this other definition here? What does that word mean? Okay, now we can talk using these words just for the sake of understanding each other, right? For the sake of argumentation, which is the basis of every human interaction, is argumentation ethics, at least if you're an Austro-libertarian and ANCAP in the Hoppe tradition, which is where I'm coming from now. Also, understanding historical context for ideas allows for, in addition to being able to argue with people coming from that ideology, it also allows one to be aware of where one's own ideas have come from, right? I can't just sit down and be like, I have created the universe from scratch, and this is the philosophy that I have that pertains to that reality. And I can do that, and again, that's kind of a Stirnerite egoist position, but I mean, I'm not a solipsist, right? I take for granted the fact that things exist outside of my mind. I take for granted my interactions with, say, my wife and my children. I could be crazy. I could be the only existent in existence, right? I could be God himself, but I find that unlikely, right? So the pragmatist kind of begins to emerge. So if we're looking at philosophies without that creatio ex nihilo, if we're looking at individual viewpoints divorced from creatio ex nihilo, then that gives us a better understanding of where people are coming from and where they're trying to go. And why I'm a big fan of economics, real economics, Austrian economics, is that describes the way that humans interact in a particular way that helps one navigate from point A to point B. So, again, the Austrian school doesn't say, this is how you ought to do things. It just says, if you do this, that's the likely outcome. So if you want that likely outcome, then you should do this, but it's up to you to decide whether or not you want that outcome. I'm kind of running around in circles now and losing my train of thought. This was directed somewhere. And since I'm coming up on 10 minutes, this looks like a good place to end this conversation. So I just kind of wanted to let everybody know, here I am, I'm still producing content, I'm just a little bit behind schedule because life is crazy, right? Instead of writing a blog post that I promised somebody about 2 weeks ago, I'm instead going to a chocolate festival for Mother's Day. I'm not a fan of fake statist holidays or fake secularist holidays, but, I am definitely a fan of traditional values such as motherhood. So there's a little bit of a contrast there, and hey, it'll make my wife and my mother happy to take them to a chocolate festival. So that's what we're going to do. Carpe Veritas, and have a great week.